And for more on this story, let's bring in Paul Melly, a consulting fellow of the Africa program at Chatham House. Thanks for being with us here on France 24. Good to see you again. So the conventional wisdom here is that with each day that goes by, the idea that there could be some kind of military intervention to restore President Bazoum to power, that grows less likely. Do you agree with that?
I think that's slightly too simplistic a way of looking at it, because the term military intervention covers a very, very wide range of possible options. It's very easy to say, well, they could employ a big force and try and launch a sort of conventional invasion. At the other end of the scale, it could be something very, very targeted. Effectively, what ECOWAS is saying is that in our negotiations or attempts to negotiate with the junta in Niamey, we're not taking force off the table. We're actually working out practical military tools to apply some pressure to Niger. But what form that would take, they haven't set out, quite deliberately, I think. But they have stressed that it would be something very targeted. So I'm not sure that as time advances, the chance of a military intervention grows less. I think constantly that option of some sort of military pressure remains on the table, but it could be much, much more narrow and focused than people are imagining. And when comparisons are made with previous interventions in countries such as Liberia, Sierra Leone, or more recently Gambia, those are very small countries. Niger, of course, is a huge territory. So a conventional takeover would be very, very difficult, probably impossible.
I think many people are hoping for a diplomatic solution here. If diplomacy is able to work and there is some kind of negotiated settlement, what might that look like?
Well, I guess a first stage of the settlement would be something that would protect or ensure the freedom of President Bazoum and the physical safety of his family. For example, he has a son, a 20-year-old son, who is being held hostage with him and who is believed to have significant health problems, but has so far not been released to secure medical checks or medical treatment outside. So I think that might be a first step in terms of goodwill. It's something that the junta could offer as a first step. Whether Bazoum himself is willing to compromise over the principle of him being the rightful head of state and what form any kind of transitional process might take remains to be seen. His strongest card remains his refusal to resign, which is in contrast to what happened in Burkina Faso and in Mali when coups were staged there. Bazoum has refused to as it were, give up the fact that he is the rightful president. And that's quite a strong negotiating card, especially because the political support for him and his party is not really in the capital, Niamey. It's in the rest of Niger, in other regions. So that's part of the process. But there could be some sort of discussion about transitional arrangements, shall we say, leading to some sort of eventual deal, but we don't have yet any idea what that deal might look like. And it's not clear that the junta either has yet reached a view on what its eventual goal would be.
Well, so there are several scenarios that could play out, but let's say the coup leaders stay in power. Where does that leave France and the U.S., which both have troops in Niger? Would they pull their troops out of the country?
Well, I think this is something that's a bit different from the situation in Mali and the situation in Burkina Faso, where France, in the case of Mali, political relations became so difficult that in the end, the French decided to pull their troops out. And Mali, of course, has subsequently requested and secured agreement for the withdrawal of the UN peacekeepers as well. In Burkina Faso, France again very quickly agreed to the withdrawal of the small deployment it had there. But in Mali, the French are saying, well, Bazoum is the rightful president. The junta is not recognized, and therefore the junta's claim that it was breaking the military cooperation agreements, Paris has refused to recognize that. The Americans, who of course were not in Mali or Burkina, but they're very determined to keep their base. They have a very important drones base in northern Niger, in Agadez. They have 1,100 troops in the country. So both of those two key Western actors seem very reluctant to reduce their military positions, but their forces are not, as it were, out there in the street or engaged on the ground very publicly in the way that the French presence in Mali was so visible. So it's in some ways it's easier for them to just sit on their current position, at least for now, in the short term.
Before I let you go, I want to ask you about the humanitarian situation in Niger. Aid groups say that these ECOWAS sanctions are preventing them from getting food and supplies into the country. What effect has this whole situation had on the humanitarian crisis in Niger?
Well, a key thing to understand about Niger is because of its climate in the Sahel, where rain only comes at this time of year and the harvest is in September or October, this means that for people in rural areas, that's to say the overwhelming majority of the population, now is the most difficult time of year. July, August, early September, before the new harvest is collected, is the point when communities are really eking out their final food reserves left from the previous year. And that's why this humanitarian aid is so important. It's part of the normal cycle, if you like, of support for rural communities, for poor people in Niger, is that very often food and money is distributed to those communities in this July-August period to help them get through these last few difficult weeks and months before the new harvest. So this isn't just humanitarian aid for people in refugee camps, such as those that we can see on the screen here at Walam. It's also for villagers across large parts of the country who are dependent on that extra humanitarian support. So this is a really very difficult and delicate time for them. And one question, a challenge for ECOWAS is how to maintain sanctions, but perhaps find a way to show much more flexibility so that the humanitarian aid can get through and can get to those rural communities.
Absolutely. Okay, Paul Melly, Consulting Fellow of the Africa Program at Chatham House. Thanks as always for your insight. We really appreciate you joining us here on France 24.
You're welcome.